Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Music Fastball by Standard Innovation. I'm Tom Mullen, and today I'm joined by Richard Hinkley, who has 25 years of experience working at major labels in the industry. We have recently been talking about our catalog maturity curve, and today we're going to be focusing on the operational pillar. And by operational pillar, we're talking about everything that can be done after acquiring a catalog to improve its performance in the market. I think this is probably the broadest pillar that we'll cover, and it really depends on what types of rights you own, whether you own recordings, masters, and everything else as to what levers you can pull. Today, very specifically, we are going to be talking about how to manage, how to optimize, how to improve recordings and their distribution, an area that Richard has a great deal of experience in. So, Rich, let's jump straight in. And I think the first misconception that we want to tackle is in the streaming area, people assume that everything is automatically distributed everywhere, but that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what most people's assumption is, and that's not the case. There are, and I think most people will have maybe some anecdotal experience of this, but there are recordings that are not available in every market. There are recordings that are not available on every streaming service. So there are gaps in the availability of artist catalogs on streaming services. And just to reference the point about that the operational aspect of recordings, there's also another factor is the fact that what is there is often not up to sort of, we call it contemporary standards as well. So there are gaps in availability, and sometimes what is there isn't in the standard it might be.
And just what do you mean exactly by that? I mean, I think a lot of people just assume, oh, it's an MP3 or an MP4. Let's whack it on the DSP. What are
Yeah.
they looking for these days?
So maybe if we break it down into the two sides, which is like, where are there issues with things being available or not? And then on the qualitative side of it, when we're talking about things that aren't available, we're often talking about albums that might be in some markets and not in others. Maybe we can go on and talk about why these things happen. And there are also instances where there are recordings on albums that are, the classic term is it's grayed out. So there's an album track listing, but there are some recordings on there that are just not playable in different markets.
It seems absolutely bonkers, doesn't it? It's like, oh, well, we've got an album, we've published it to one of these global platforms, yet some of the songs just aren't available in XYZ territory.
Yeah, and I think it's important to state that very often these are, if you like, sins of omission rather than anything malicious. It's a function of how music has historically been released, so that it mirrors its way over into streaming. The world we're in now is a very different one. That we're in a world now where the default is music is released globally on the same date to every service.
Right.
We're coming from a world where releases were, they grew and they evolved. Back in the physical era, music would be released in the home market, and then other territories as the story built would opt in as an artist developed.
We hear that a lot, like, oh, the industry's really made for a different time when, physical was the biggest thing, the biggest driver, and supply chains, logistics, relationships, and all of those factored in. And it seems like we've carried on a whole bunch of those into a new way of distribution.
Well, what's happened, I suppose, is as streaming arrived, that sort of the digital footprint was the place to start. Generally, was like, let's port over what is on iTunes and other digital retail sites, and that was often, those releases evolved in the way that the physical releases evolved as well. So we're kind of market by market very often.
Yeah.
So that was just ported over, if you like. And
is that really a copyright thing that made them do it that way?
No, less a copyright thing. It's more, it has its roots really in terms of how music was marketed and how artists were developed.
Okay.
So if you starting with a new artist, you would start developing that artist in their home market, and you would look to get traction at home and then in a handful of markets and grow the story globally.
So it's just an efficiency thing. It's like, okay, well, we've got a global platform. We could onboard all of these songs in every single market. However, there's an operating overhead to do that. Actually, we just want to bring it on for that market because that's where they're big.
Yes, because the process of those, if you like, those releases and those setups, every time that artist music was released in a given market, something was set up in a system that indicated this should be available in a given market.
Right.
So you have two options. You would either go back and rewrite absolutely everything or just carry over what you've got. And
Yeah,
it's
fair
much more
enough.
efficient to carry over what you've got. There's a second factor in this as well, which is that, so we've talked about how releases often would evolve and with impartial footprints, which is around the fragmentation of how music is released, particularly to do with when an artist may do a deal, or there may be different labels with different territory rights. So there are different parties releasing that music in different parts of the world. And of course, that can cause gaps and errors and things between that as well, that leads to things being
Right.
imperfectly available.
So, I mean, in this world where we expect distribution to be global and relatively seamless, we've actually got a whole bunch of reasons and backstory as to why that's not necessarily the case, from, missing or messy metadata, specific versions of either video and or lyrics and or audio recording that's required on the various platforms. I mean, there's a whole host of different things that could really go wrong there, isn't there? I think the question for our audience specifically, it's what are the implications commercially of these gaps?
Yeah. The fundamental issue is one of the surface area of your catalog, which is if you have imperfect or partial availability of your recordings, then there are recordings that cannot be streamed. If a recording cannot be streamed, it cannot earn. And in a world where, was it last year, there were 7 trillion streams, a lot of music consumption just happens. And a key determinant of the success of the catalog is the likelihood of your music being streamed. And if you're not available to be streamed, then inevitably that restricts the full potential of the catalog.
Right. If you don't buy a ticket, you're not going to win the lottery, kind of thing.
Exactly that. Exactly that. Yeah. And that's there's two, that's both, if you like, a baseline underlying level of consumption, and it also limits the opportunity or the upside when there are major moments of attention on a recording or a catalog. So, a classic viral track moment that might cause consumption to accelerate globally, you're not going to see the full benefit from that. Or if there is marketing or artist activity that causes an increase in interest and demand in that artist, you won't be seeing the full benefit from that.
Yeah, which makes total sense. If you don't have the your entire catalog prepped, primed, and delivered everywhere, then you're just missing out on opportunities. I think there's another really interesting one as well, isn't there? Particularly if we're talking about distribution through global territories, is they might be the earliest insights into growth in those territories. Just by not having parts of the catalog actually published there, you could be missing out on critical insight to say, hey, actually, we've noticed a disproportionate uptick in streams or consumption in this geography or this genre in that geography. Maybe we should go and spend a bit more time and effort. If you're not getting any of that information because it's not published there, then you, you're just going to miss out, aren't you?
And particularly when maybe you have larger catalogs where there are issues within those. So it's not simply a question of, for instance, everything's missing in Canada and Canada is giving you a blank. But if you have got part of your catalog missing in, let's say, Canada, Canada may look, when you're looking at your ranked territories, Canada may look like a less significant market than it might actually be.
Yeah, which is absolutely, really critical insight, particularly given the value that we get from data from the streaming platforms. if you're missing out and you just don't have a presence there, then you're going to miss those early lead indicators of opportunity or indeed decline. I think
Yeah.
just kind of coming back to some of the reasons why the catalogs can be in that shape and recordings might not be distributed evenly. We've obviously talked about some of the historical ones, which by and large, we can't really go and change retrospectively. Uh, However, I think for a lot of the audience and people who are buying music rights, one of the big areas to consider is when catalogs change hand. There's a whole bunch of processes that have to happen. Can you just talk us through that and the challenges that that presents and some of the reasons why that leads to imperfect distribution?
Yes. So there's when we talk about catalogs changing hands, we can talk about different aspects of catalogs changing hands. But if
Yeah.
we, for instance, if you take the example even of just recordings changing hands, and even at a simple level where maybe a label is moving its distribution from one distributor to another, there is a process of redelivery and takedown that can be um, that causes potential disruption or breakage there, because has everything been redelivered properly, and has everything from the prior distributor been taken down? And there's a parallel issue to, if you like, gaps in availability around duplicate and conflicting availability, because
Yeah.
sometimes the new owner may deliver the catalog, but the prior owner hasn't actually fully taken it all down. Again, it's often not malicious, it's just oversight, or it just hasn't, because these teams are all busy. But that will mean that the new owner
And then
isn't,
you've got disputes, right?
yeah, or the new, and it means that the new owner is not going to earn on every single stream of those recordings, because there are still other recordings existing there.
Yeah.
And in the case I referenced earlier, the fact that sometimes there may be rights may sit with two different labels with different geographic footprints. Sometimes we've seen examples where one of those parties is inadvertently delivering some of that material into the other label's market. So there are these overlaps and duplicates and conflicts, as well as there can be gaps.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really fascinating to hear all of those things, and there's so many other reasons, aren't there? Whether it be like operational pressure, focus, just whether they've got the the distributors that actually got the bums on the seats to be able to do these things, because in many cases we're talking about hundreds of thousands in total, millions, hundreds of millions of records here. That takes an awful lot of upkeep, and we're not talking about a single market, a single platform. We're talking about hundreds of markets, many tens of platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a key characteristic of the music industry, particularly recorded music industry, is the the speed with which it moves, and the relentless focus on what is now and what is next. That comes in, be that in terms of the next recording from the artist, the next artist that is being signed, or the next project that is being marketed from the artist in the catalog. So there's the direction of view is almost entirely forward. There's very little bandwidth to retrospectively check or validate. So
Yeah.
so these things are often, and these things are actually quite difficult to see sat in one market, to see what is going on in other parts of the world.
And there's just so many variables, aren't there? You know, whether it be data inconsistency, whether it be operational inconsistency, it takes an awful lot of looking at. And I think that kind of brings us on to like, what can we do about it and why do we care? I think obviously if you look at the market, the vast majority of the recordings are owned historically by the labels. And that means by and large, a lot of the rights that are owned by funds are secondary rights, or rather other rights that don't necessarily include the recordings. So they might be sitting there questioning, okay, well, if we don't actually own the things, what can we do about it? Or what do we need to know so we can go and ask the right questions so the people who can do something about it will actually do it. And by doing it, the net result should be greater distribution, greater consumption, and therefore greater downstream value.
Yes. I think there are two things to sort of bear in mind in terms of how one would approach this. The first is that where there are issues like this, remedying them is to the benefit of everybody concerned. So if you like, if maybe a fund has a royalty stream or a publishing interest in something that sits where the recordings sit with a label still, if there are issues in the availability of that catalog, the label is going to see benefit from remedying those issues. So there is a reason to care. The other thing to think about, to consider, which is where this can be difficult, is just how busy those labels are and understanding how these things get fixed. And I think if I were to suggest that the key steps to it, the first step would be to identify what those issues are yourself, because going to a label and say, can you just check that everything is where it should be? That's a really open-ended question. And back to our original assumption, most things are where they should be. Everything's where it should be. Those people are busy. That's not a question that's going to jump to the top of anybody's to-do list. But if you're able to identify specifically things that are missing, where you know that the rights do exist for that, things are missing, and even more helpful would be what needs to change in order to effect a remedy for it, then the conversation with the label can be, we've identified the following gaps where affecting a change in the availability of the following album products would remedy that. Can you confirm that that is possible, and can you execute it? There's a much more defined ask there.
When people are looking to do that gap analysis, like, what would be, to put you on the spot, the top 3 things that you would look out for as, okay, litmus test, do we have these? Like, are all of those done across our top 20, 30, 40% of the catalog?
Let me think about that. It's very difficult without actually doing the kind of work to see what issues there are, to speculate as to what the issues might be, because they can appear anywhere in 180 plus markets on different services. But taking a view, doing the audit work to identify where there are inconsistencies in availability can give you a view where you can then do the work to filter the key markets for that artist, because obviously different artists have a different geographic footprint, and you can then quickly identify where there are key markets with issues that may, and if there are key markets with issues, that's worth addressing. If there are some really minor markets with minor issues, then it's not even worth your time doing it. So that's
And what
where
would you put in that camp of, like, key issues? I think understanding the definition of key markets is obviously just based on consumption and historical analysis, but, like, where would you go prodding first?
I think to identify that we know what key markets look like in terms of key issues. Obviously, not every recording is the same in terms of its significance, but one of the nature of these problems, they often tend to show up in album packets. So it's not just one track here or there. It'll be maybe an album it doesn't have its delivery in certain markets. So I think you're looking at addressing the surface area point. So there is every reason to look to make fully available your artist or that catalog discography. So, I mean, clearly, if the artist's biggest hit or biggest album is missing in the biggest market, there's certainly
Then you got a
greater
problem.
urgency there to it.
Yeah.
But if you're aware of there being issues that in meaningful markets, you should fix it anyway, because to that point around, there's a baseline level of consumption that you're going to shift, but also opportunity comes from all sorts of different angles now. So you're just giving your catalog that greater readiness whenever opportunity arises in whatever form it does.
Okay. So, I mean, it sounds just like, look, there isn't a quick fix, silver bullet solution. You just have to do the work, across the catalog that you own to check whether the recorded music is in the right markets, in the right formats, in the right compilations of albums and collections and everything else. Um, and that is a bit of a methodical process. Now, obviously, I think, yeah, with people with several 100,000 various different rights or associated with songs, then that could be a pretty arduous task. And I think, knowing where to look is probably pretty key, but then also just having a process to be able to do that methodically is pretty important too, because I mean, to do it manually, you're just going to be spending years looking at that, aren't you?
Yes, certainly, and that's why, we spent the last, couple of years really building a capability to be able to do that quickly, so that people aren't sitting there on VPNs looking at what Spotify looks like in 100 plus markets.
Yeah.
So we can do a sweep to identify where the gaps are, because the gaps will be invisible to many people, or to most people really, because of the nature of the reasons that those gaps appear. So if I give you an example,
Yeah.
we did a project where the client had rights, was a label client. They had rights for this artist catalog in half of the world. What we identified was the third party with rights in another part of the world was delivering some of their recordings into client market. So they could issue a takedown on that. But what we also found was that there were recordings, most of the catalog was missing from a number of markets in our client's area, simply because, if you like, the full list of territories had inadvertently omitted some countries. And so, if you like, it had been technically set up per the contract, but the contract didn't mean to omit those markets. So it's like, even that sort of check against contract
Yeah.
had been, by the contract, been set up properly, but the spirit of the contract and what was intended was fuller availability. So
Yeah.
it was that work to it. It was only by spotting the gaps that we could ask the question.
And this is just kind of atypical of the volume that we're talking about, right? There always
Yeah.
are things that do fall through the gaps. And I think, a general topic that we're talking about at the minute is how to fix the leak. So actually how to plug these gaps so we're not missing revenue that could and should be there, whether that be through distribution of the recorded music in the various platforms, or any other reasons that could really lead to that. So I think the last question that I would have as a fund who owns rights but doesn't necessarily own the recordings, like, who do I go and speak to at a label if I go to them with this comprehensive list to say, hey, we've done this audit on all of the songs that we own. We can see that in these markets, either they don't have the right most recent format, there's a video missing, or this album doesn't have that track available. Comprehensive list, super helpful. Who do you actually go and speak to try and get it resolved?
The best place to go would be one of two places. So it would be, first of all, in the territory, the label that actually is the repertoire owner. So, for instance, if it is an artist that is signed to the UK, you want to be speaking to the UK label. So even if you're based, say, in the States or Switzerland or somewhere, speak to someone at the UK label, because they have the contract there. And speak to either the actual repertoire owning label, the frontline label that originally signed the catalog, and they could direct you, or the catalog team in that market. The process of fixing it involves different stakeholders, because there would need to do a legal rights check to validate that, just double check they actually have it. The label would want to do a check, because sometimes there are reasons, maybe artist relation reasons, why things aren't available. So just actually, are we cool to release it, to make sure this is available? And then there's a digital operations element, which is remedying it. But the point of entry would be the label that signed it originally, or is the catalog team responsible for it? And I would suggest
Right.
the business affairs teams in those would be the place to go.
And I think, like in any industry, getting stuff done is, if you know the right people, your life just
Yeah.
becomes easier. And the music industry very much is a people industry. So
Yeah.
building the right relationships, taking the time to find people that already have those existing relationships. There's a lot of people like you guys out there who actually already have some amazing relationships and can be a shortcut to getting some of these things done, which is super valuable. So just really to wrap up, I think, obviously the record music is absolutely critical in distribution and therefore
Mhm.
a key component to generating revenue. Without it, we're not going to get very far. And if it's not distributed equally in all of the territories, that's going to create gaps. And I think if we think about this as the building blocks to achieve more future revenue, actually fixing the leaks is really at the bottom, making sure that we've got everything in great order so that we know any future efforts around advertising, syncs, or anything else are going to drive and capture the most amount of revenue and therefore value indeed for uh, people who own the rights. So super important, like actually getting
Yeah.
these things done, doing those audits is really, really critical. Rich, that's been really fascinating. And I think if people do want to reach out with Rich at Rep Music, we'll drop a link in the show notes. Uh, Definitely worthwhile having a look at doing an audit, making sure that all of the rights you own have the recordings in all of the territories that you would expect, getting in contact with the right people at the labels to go and get those resolved. I think just the general inquiries line is not going to be very fruitful. So lean on those relationships and look out for more content around this topic, really fixing the leaks and helping to improve operational maturity in managing the catalog. There'll be plenty more episodes simply because it's a huge, huge topic and it really varies depending on the rights types that you own. Rich, thank you so much for your time today. And everybody, thank you for tuning in to Music Fastball.
Thanks, Tom.